Hello, and thanks for joining me today. My name's Jeff, and you're listening to episode 26 of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. Hello, and welcome back to another edition of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. First off, before we begin, I'd like to apologize. I've missed the last couple of days. There were some good books that were released over the last couple of days. You can head over to comicbookoftheday.com to check them out if you'd like to see them. One was a Charlton book, and then the other one was an X-Men Uncanny X-Men book that I really loved and was regretful that I didn't get a chance to podcast about it. But unfortunately, I had a really bad toothache, and I had to go to the dentist on Friday and yada, yada, yada. To make a long story short, I've just been hopped up taking pain medication for the last couple of days, but I'm okay now. And it's Sunday, and I got really sort of sad that I missed a couple of days of podcasting, so I wanted to jump back in and get back to it and not miss any more days. So I appreciate you sticking with me, and I'm sorry that you didn't get some really good podcasts over the last couple of days. That X-Men book would have been great to talk about, and maybe at some point I might dive back in and maybe do an extra bonus issue of the podcast or bonus episode of the podcast and maybe talk about that X-Men, because I really love those books. I really love those John Byrne, Chris Claremont books, and man, you just can't get enough of that kind of stuff. So, but today's comic book of the day is an interesting one, and I hope it. I kind of feel like there's a lot to discuss about it. Today's book is Ronin. This is book one of the 6-issue series. I believe it's 6 issues, yeah. And this is published in July of 1983 by DC Comics. Goodness gracious. Gosh, I don't really know where to begin with this book. This book has good and bad. I vacillate between liking this series and not liking this series, and this launches me into a larger discussion about Frank Miller and my thoughts on Frank Miller. I'm just absolutely conflicted about my love / hate for Frank Miller. I don't, Ronin, this was published in 1983. This isn't something that in 1983, this isn't something I would have been, in my mid-teens, and I don't recall getting this at the time. For some reason, if I close my eyes and I imagine when I was first turned on to this book, I believe it was after I got in the Navy. I remember I was stationed in the Navy in Whidbey Island, Washington, in a small town called Oak Harbor, and it is exactly like you imagined. In fact, I remember when I first landed on the island, I had to fly from SeaTac Airport in Seattle, and I had to fly a little single-engine plane to get from Seattle Airport to Whidbey Island, Washington, which is north of Seattle. It's probably about an hour north of Seattle, and it is, in fact, a little island, and there's a naval air station on that island. Not a Navy base, so there's no ships there, but it is a naval air station, and I flew in a little single-engine plane. There's a little teeny municipal airport on the island, and in order to get to the island, you have to fly, or you could drive. There are ferries that get there, and there's a bridge up at the north end. But I remember when I first arrived on the island and drove around to a point where I was able to see Oak Harbor for the first time off in the distance, I was immediately struck by how it reminded me of the Popeye movie, Sweet Haven. It reminded me of the little town of Sweet Haven in the Popeye movie. A little coastal town on the edge of the water, tucked away in a little cove. But it was a small town, and there was one comic book shop there. And when I was, I would have been around 18 or 19, and this would have been in the mid to late 80s. And I really dug the comic book shop there. It was a small shop. It was a bookstore that also sold comics. And I remember that was where I bought the Watchmen series. I remember at the time that was where I started to read Love and Rockets in earnest. I think, and I don't know if it was really a zeitgeist type thing that at the time that independent comics or creator-owned comics or those types of books were becoming popular, but I just remember this was just around the time that I discovered Sandman, and I read Ronin and Watchmen, and there were all of these great comics that were being published at the time. But I think this is where I first discovered Ronin. I might have bought it as a back issue, gone through the back issue bin and bought it. And I remember at the time it was a fairly big deal because of, the idea of Baxter paper. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what the idea of Baxter paper is, but at the time DC was publishing books. Their monthly books would be published on newsprint paper, which was essentially like newspaper, but they reserved miniseries and small press books or small run books or prestige books. They reserved for this Baxter paper, which was like what they called a prestige format book. I think there was Camelot 3000 was another book that was published around the same time that had the same type of paper. Watchmen, I believe, if memory serves, and I might have to go back and dig through my Watchmen issues to see if that's printed on Baxter paper. But I just remember that there were these prestigious limited edition or limited series that was kind of a new thing at the time. There weren't a lot of miniseries being published, and the idea that miniseries at the time were an event. And because of the event status of them, right, because they were special and they were outside of continuity and outside of monthly published books, they were kind of a big deal. And I seem to recall that this was something that was a big deal because of the fact that it was published on Baxter paper, nice, shiny, thick, gloss stock paper, which really, very white, right? It's a very white paper. It's not sort of an off-white color like newsprint paper tends to be. It was a very white, bleached, shiny paper, so it made colors, sort of pop. So books that were printed on Baxter paper really, really popped. And this one, being colored by Lynn Varley, is one of those. She's a wonderful, wonderful colorist. Partnered with Frank Miller on The Dark Knight Returns. And this series is just beautifully painted, beautifully colored by Lynn Varley. So this might potentially be, I think, the first team up of Frank Miller and Lynn Varley. I would probably have to dig into that as well. I'm not really sure, but I think this was the first time that I recalled them teaming up together. And look, I'll be honest. Frank Miller is just hit or miss with me. Some books, really, really awesome. A lot of people think Dark Knight Returns is a little bit overrated, and, perhaps, I can see it. I don't know necessarily that it holds up to additional readings without a little bit of the understanding of the context of Ronald Reagan and the world at the time, and the way people viewed Reagan's presidency at the time, who weren't sort of like die-hard Republicans. But I remember, at the time that the context of Dark Knight was that that it was groundbreaking. I'm not necessarily sure that it holds up very well over time. The sequels are so bad. And then, counter to that, this is a book that he was inspired to write after spending some time on his first run of Daredevil books, right? So this is his first, after he had done some of the Elektra stuff in The Hand, and writing some of the Asian samurai inspired Daredevil books that he had written prior to this, and this, I believe, was sort of that inspiration is what led to this book. And this book is, heavily influenced by manga, Mobius. It's got a beautiful design style. It definitely feels like an experimental book. It definitely feels like an artist and a writer and a creative endeavor that's experimental and trying different things. And I'm not necessarily sure that on the first read I really got this book. I do remember being somewhat maybe nonplussed by it, thinking that it was good, but probably not tremendously great. I think it established sort of the cadence in my mind of how hit and miss Frank Miller could be. If I had to rattle off some of my favorite Frank Miller stuff, I think, first and foremost would be the Daredevil work. All of the work that he did on Daredevil. I think nothing that he's done on Daredevil would be considered bad. I think that the Batman Year One that he did with David Mazzucchelli is beautiful. I love that book. He didn't illustrate that book, but he wrote the story, and I thought, it was a groundbreaking story at the time. He did the additional work on 300, of course, and Sin City was really hit or miss with me. I'm not necessarily someone who would be a huge Sin City fan, and I didn't follow a lot of his work in the Legend imprint. So he's just, I don't know, someone who's been really, good, bad, great, awesome, not so good, terrible. It's all over the map with me. But, I guess at the end of the day, you have to give a creator credit for pushing the boundaries and pushing themselves and trying different things and writing different stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's hit or miss with me. And this one is probably, I don't know, I would say right down the middle, maybe. It's it's a sort of a futuristic samurai tale, dystopian New York City, set in the future. It has ties back to the samurai past. It eventually becomes an allegory. I'm not gonna spoil it, but I think if you are a fan of the Old Testament, you would probably catch on to what's going on here towards the end. Definitely something that you've got to pay attention to and sort of read meticulously. So if you're the kind of person who likes to, jump into comic books as a sort of lighthearted form of entertainment, this is probably something that's going to, be a speed bump to you at the very least, I think, because this does require a little bit of attention and a little bit of it just requires you to be a little bit more focused in your reading and stay with it. It definitely is something that pays off at the end. But you have to admit that the combination of Frank Miller and Lynn Varley is just something to be, it's something to behold. It's a beautiful looking book. The cover to this book is gorgeous. Right now, if I look in Overstreet, I see that, near mint copies of this, 9.2 near mint go for about $12 to $15 in Overstreet. So, this is going to be an easily affordable book for you to find. If a near mint 9.2 Overstreet goes for about $12, I'm thinking that you should easily be able to find all 6 copies of this book at a convention for around $20. If you're like me, I love when sellers at conventions will do things like bundle up books and sell them as sets. So you might be able to find this set for about $20. And if you do, don't forget to haggle, because you might be able to bargain your way down to a little bit less than the asking price of this one, because I don't see that there's a huge demand for this book. So, but anyway, you owe it to yourself to check it out if you haven't read it. It's definitely something that should be on your to-do list. It's again, you have to make up your mind about, how you feel about Frank Miller and how you feel about his writing. But head over to comicbookoftheday.com and give it a shot and take a look at it and see what you think. Comicbookoftheday.com is the website. You can follow us on Facebook at Comic Book of the Day. We're also on Instagram and Twitter if you want to reach out to us on social media. Let us know what you think of Frank Miller. Let us know what you think of this. Let us know what your favorite Frank Miller stories are, and perhaps we'll add those to the Comic Book of the Day podcast and maybe talk about them. But once again, thank you for being patient. Apologies for missing the last couple of days. It's not intended, and I'm back on the horse and looking forward to delivering you some more daily podcasts of wonderful books. So thank you once again. This is the Comic Book of the Day podcast. I'm Jeff, and we'll see you tomorrow.